Morning all, I'd like to show you a really interesting game from round 2 of the Caro-Kann Memorial, played between Maxime Vachier Lagrave, who's the French number 1, against Liren, who's currently, I believe, number 2 Chinese player in the world. So e4 from Maxime, and we see the Caro-Kann being used, c6, d4, d5, and the advanced variation is chosen by Maxime, bishop f5, and now a tricky move, h4. I think this is called the towel variation. h4 has some dangers to it, and often players are trying to prevent with black the move g4 here, and often play h5. But actually we see in this game the move h6, which in my view carries a few significant dangers, potentially allowing this g4 move, which is actually played here, so testing black. Now usually the move here is bishop d7, because after bishop e4, say, or bishop h7, white has the possibility of playing e6, a disruptive pawn sacrifice. So bishop d7 is quite an often played move here, but black actually played bishop e4 in this position. Maxime kicked that bishop back to h7, and so we have this possibility of a disruptive pawn sack, which is actually used here. So e6, this is in the style of, say, Mikhail Tal, but it's a very, very logical positional pawn sacrifice to cause disruption and congestion for development if it's taken, and white would mark out this e5 square, put more pressure on e5 to try and prevent black liberating with e5 later. Now here, actually, black decided to just ignore the pawn by playing knight f6. So knight f6 was played, and now white doesn't really want to play e takes f7. He's kind of liberating black's position potentially. If black plays e6, then bishop d6. You can see that it'll be helping black to take that pawn. So the pawn is kept there with a move which seems a little bit controversial in some respects. Bishop f4 takes an eye off the b2 pawn, and black tries to punish this neglect of b2 with a forcing move here, queen b6. So putting pressure on d4 and b2, and it's quite awkward to try and defend this b2 pawn. And this next move is very, very clever for trying to defend b2 and trying to keep the dynamism going in the white position. In fact, it's so clever, I wonder if you can spot it if I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, the move played looks crazy at first, knight c3, because it's positively inviting queen takes b2, which seems to be a double attack on c2 and c3. But the idea is revealed now, the very, very clever idea, which I hope you had thought of if you had looked at knight c3. The incredibly imaginative move, king d2 now. The king is protecting c3 and c2, and now white is threatening rook b1, taking on b7. So we have really a wild opening here. Against taking on b7, black has to be very careful now. He plays queen b6 on d4, so there's no time for rook b1. White defends d4, but white's still threatening potentially rook b1 on b7 now, because this bishop cuts along that diagonal. So we see now a6, just to be able to tuck the queen on a7, to keep defending b7 and keep an eye on d4. So rook b1, queen a7. But this pawn remains here, and these resources here remain tied down, unable to be developed that easily. We see knight a4 now with a concrete threat of knight b6, winning the exchange. Black stops that with b5, shielding the b6 square. The knight goes into c5, protecting e6 now, in case black ever dreamt of taking like this. But white also now potentially threatens g5. This is uncomfortable to have this bishop here potentially, if black ever wants to be able to play hg. I think this next move is designed to be able to answer g5 with hg. We see now bishop e5, which makes way for knight f4, and potentially protecting this rook and still ploughing on with g5. So something like knight f4, you would imagine is quite strong. Bishop d3 and then g5. Black now takes the decision as well. His bishop is behind this pawn, protecting it against the knight. So he has the option, which he takes now, of taking on e6. So finally, that positional pawn sacrifice is taken. So we've had two positional pawn sacrifices, one here for this b2. Was that poisoned? Well, it's led to a very weird position for black, being two pawns up here, but having congestion issues, potentially on both sides of the board. Knight f4, and that g6 square seems a very juicy location for the knight to attack the rook on h8. Black now plays knight bd7, challenging these two pieces. White takes that. After the knight takes, now black is threatening knight takes and potentially queen d4 or queen f2. These have to be factored in. White's next move not only attacks the rook but protects e5. Black takes on e5 and now d takes e5, knowing that the knight is protecting the pawn against queen d4 check. Also the rook of course is attacked. The rook moves, h5, holding the knight. Interesting in this position might have been check, but I think white should be okay here with king c1. For example, the rook moves now f4, c5, and white can play now rook b3, and this seems okay for white, believe it or not. It's crazy positions to check out. So anyway, here rook h7, and we see h5 holding that knight comfortably. So these pieces are all blocked in by their own pawns here. Now black plays actually the move c5, believe it or not, f4, bishop f7, this is not going to be snapped off, queen f3, now black castles queenside. White potentially has a4 at the right time. This is dangerous to try and undermine this structure, but for the moment bishop e2 is played, and now after c4 it seems some of the effect, the power of a4 has been taken away by blunting this bishop, but a4 is being played anyway, and there are some ideas here of using the queen either here or here under various conditions. So in this position, for example, queen d4 check might not be that effectual. The king could drop back, and depending on where the black queen goes, say it goes to c5, then here after queen c5 maybe queen c3, and queen a5 is a dangerous threat. So b5 is a real target. This is really, there's not enough resources to protect these pawns, it seems, with the queen coming in like this. And if the queen goes to b6, again white can put some more pressure on the position with takes, and then queen a3. So wherever the queen goes, this queen can use the neglected squares of the opponent's queen, and it's very, very dangerous for black here. There's numerous threats in this position. So okay, so in the game we see actually black deciding to try and get this rook to help the queen. So king c7 was played, doing a counter pawn sack. A takes, rook takes b5. So what's the idea of this counter pawn sack? Well, check, but now the king actually doesn't really want to go to c1 to face, for example, rook a8. Plays the king goes to e1. So after rook a8, the king is potentially crawling like this to safety on the king side. Rook b1 to defend against rook a1, rook a2, now forcing move c3, check, and the king goes now to f2. So it looks a little bit cozier here. Rook c2. And you might wonder in all this, by the way, well, why couldn't this knight have taken on f8? Well, always there was rook h8 and gaining a tempo. If the knight steps back, then taking and then carrying on. Just for example, in this position, when the knight was able to take here, on knight takes f8 here, rook h8, you see this mechanism that the knight, if it goes back now, black should have compensation. And you might think, well, hang on, white's a bishop up here. Here's a very, very complicated computer line to show that this bishop's kind of hemmed in by these pawns, and black can actually activate both rooks with the queen. I'll just show you for those technically interested. Queen b2. Now, just in time, rook a8, because it looks as though white's crashing through, but now just in time, rook a3, and here rook e3, and black in this position has sufficient initiative, it seems, after taking, to be able to perpetually attack the queen. The queen has to hold f3 here. So this kind of infiltration, according to my earlier analysis, should be able to hold for black with perpetually attacking the queen. A remarkable variation stemming from knight takes f8 here, if this knight did take. So in the game we saw casually c3. You know, you might think, what is going on in this game? So queen d2 check, king f2. Now rook c2, again offering this bishop here, but again for the same reason, black can carry on with things after rook h8 taking on g6. So white actually does a very interesting move, queen e3, seeing the king as an attacking piece in this position. Black takes, king takes, offering c3, king d4. If the king steps to c5, this starts to be potentially a little bit dangerous. Rook c2, attacking the bishop, rook he1. Anytime, again, knight takes, there's rook h8, and taking and carrying on here. King c6 is played in this position. Okay, now here it really does seem as though, really, you know, why not knight takes f8 here? Actually, in this particular position, isn't there any position where knight takes f8 is tempting? Knight takes f8 actually apparently is very strong here. Knight takes f8 in this position, rook b8 is actually on this analysis is great. In this particular position, after king c6, knight f8 is great, and rook b8 is actually a slight inaccuracy that was played here. Rook b8. So that's very interesting here, that this when it was extremely ripe to play it, rook b8 was played instead. Now black takes, but there is an idea that white has nevertheless in this position, foreseeing this position, that rook eb1 is threatening a kind of mating net now against the black king, believe it or not. So that's the idea. The bishop didn't even have to be taken. These resources are locked up. Black plays check. So if he takes, after rook 1 to b6, king c7, king c5 in this position is forcing mate because of rook 6 to b7 mate. And so that's why I didn't mind this position. So check, after rook eb1, check, we see check, king e3, rook a2, and here after rook 8 to b6, black actually resigned in this position. A possible continuation is king c7, king d4, and now given that this is immune, white is actually threatening rook takes e6, and that's really, really crushing just to take here and then take here. These pieces are not very inspired. So for example, if rook a5 to fend off king c5, rook takes e6, it's all over because of bishop f3 and taking on d5. So the mating net's not needed, it's staved off but at a huge cost. So basically after this check here, actually black had enough of his position, didn't want to be tortured anymore. Very interesting dynamic game in the style of Tau, I think, with the multiple pawn sacrifices, chaos ensuing. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.